It's the OG fact checker, here to give you a juicy tidbit of history that's verified. Of all the World War II veterans I've covered thus far, I think this one was the most fun I've had to write about. I know I'm jumping the gun since this is only episode 18, and I found other cool veterans to write about. But when I did research on my subject, I screamed with joy over the discovery. Yeah, seriously, I did that, especially when I found out that his cartoon work can be seen in the opening credits to one of my favorite 1976 classic movies, the comedy cult favorite Murder by Death. Fun fact about that movie, the screenplay was written by famed playwright Neil Simon, who wrote The Odd Couple and Biloxi Blues, and it was Truman Capote's only movie role. Right now, there's a lot of buzz over one of his most well-known and loved creations. As a kid, I watched black and white TV reruns of the live-action version of his cartoon that originally ran for 2 years from 1964 to 1966. That TV show sparked a series of movies in the 1990s starring Raul Julia, Angelica Houston, and Christina Ricci, in a role that has had a recent resurgence on Netflix. On a side note, her middle name is Friday. When there is such a sensational buzz about a fictional character, it's easy to forget who created that sensation. But in this cartoonist's heyday, at the peak of his popularity, the question on everyone's lips, including famed director Alfred Hitchcock, was, what is Charles Addams really like? You'd be surprised at the level of fascination over Charles Samuel Addams from Westfield, New Jersey, also known as Chaz Addams. I'll fill you in on the extra D in his surname later. People around the world wanted to know if he was as macabre as his cartoon, The Addams Family, as well as others he did for The New Yorker. My source for this episode is the 2006 biography Chaz Addams, A Cartoonist's Life by Linda H. Davis. If you know the theme song to this TV show by heart, like I do, then you understand why the title of this episode is He's Ooky, Kooky and Spooky, and a distant relative to John Adams. Charles Samuel Addams, known as Chaz or Charlie, was the only child born in January 1912 to parents Charles Huey Addams and Grace Spear Addams. Living in the Addams household was his real version of Grandmama, who he called Grandma Spear, born Emma Louise Tuft Spear of Jersey City, New Jersey. Now, I'm going to trace back Addams's maternal and paternal lineage for a little bit and explain the different spelling of his surname. I had to draw this one out on paper to get it straight in my head so that I could write about it. Addams really was a descendant through his maternal grandmother, Grandma Spear, of 2 U.S. presidents, John Adams, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and our second president, and John Quincy Adams, our 6th president. Grandma Spear was a true blue blood. She was a descendant of the founder of Tufts University, Charles Tufts, one of the oldest families in Massachusetts. She was also a descendant of Anne Adams, who was 3rd cousin to John Adams, making her also related to Samuel Adams, another signer of the Declaration of Independence, who was 2nd cousin to John Adams. With all the lineage I just mapped out for you, you might think that Adams was named after those famous names on his paternal side, but not so. It was from his paternal line, which was rooted in Pennsylvania from the time of William Penn's distribution of land. Once I traced everyone, I realized that the names Charles, Huey, spelled with and without an E, and Samuel were used multiple times in the family tree, which was driving me nuts. The extra D in his surname came from Isaac Adams, Chaz's 3rd grandfather, who did it to set himself apart from a neighbor with the same last name. Adams's 2nd grandfather, Samuel, had 10 children. 2 of those children were Charles Huey, no E, Adams, his great-grandfather, and John Huey, no E, Addams, his great uncle. John Huey had 9 children, and one of them was Jane Addams, his first cousin once removed, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Addams credited his mother Grace for his rather off kilter sense of humor. And if you were hoping for sordid tales about a horrific childhood, you'd be disappointed. He gleefully reported that his childhood in Westfield, New Jersey was ordinary, with no trauma to speak of. His mother was easygoing, as was his father, and his father absolutely adored his mother and couldn't stand to be apart from his little family when his job as a traveling salesman took him on the road. From the age of 6, Addams began drawing and illustrating, crediting his father Charles Sr. for his artistic talent. He favored illustrators mostly, like Gustave Doré, a French printmaker, woodcarver, and illustrator known for his Bible themed artwork as well as his illustrations for Dante's Inferno. Addams was also drawn to the work of John Tenniel, a British Victorian era artist famous for his illustrations for Alice in Wonderland and its sequel, Through the Looking Glass. When Addams reached his preteens, he discovered Albert Pinkham Ryder, a Massachusetts born landscape artist who was rumored to be a recluse. Ryder, once greatly influenced by the Barbizon school style of painting, abruptly shifted his attention from the outdoors to mystical/religious themes in his art. Fascinated by chivalrous tales of knights, Addams contacted a museum curator at MoMA for advice on how to build a suit of armor, but was discouraged from doing so. Instead, Addams opted to build a longbow, which he designed himself with the help of his father, who provided the materials. He often practiced with his homemade longbow at a nearby lake where his dentist had hanged himself. By the time Addams entered high school, he had won Best Prize for a drawing contest for a chain of clothing stores. Classmates remember him as a charming bon vivant who was never short of female company and had the ability to make his English teacher laugh from his drawings. He pursued creative work in high school. He was on the school newspaper, serving as art editor, and created a cartoon strip. By this time, added to his list of influences were cartoonists Percy Crosby, creator of the Skippy cartoon, and George Harriman, the creator of the Crazy Cat comic strip. On a side note, I'm acknowledging the fact that Harriman is controversial for his portrayal of black-faced characters in his comic strip, the type of humor that was commonly accepted at the time. His characters wished they could lighten their skin and spoke in a kind of pidgin English or Creole that readers barely understood. William Randolph Hearst, the publishing mogul who he worked for, liked him and the comic strip so much that he gave him a raise just because. But in 1971, Harriman became even more controversial when it was discovered that although he identified as white on the U.S. Census, at birth he was recorded as colored on his New Orleans birth certificate, with his parents identifying as mulatto. After graduating high school, Addams spent a year at Colgate University before transferring to the University of Pennsylvania, majoring in architecture for a year. His third and final transfer was to the Grand Central School of Art in New York City, where he felt at home. But this homey feeling wasn't enough to keep Addams in class. Carrying charcoal and a sketch pad, he would roam about the city to people watch, or he would ride the double-decker open-air buses on Fifth Avenue and study the architecture, a sweep of Gothic revival, limestone, Art Deco, Golden Age townhouses, and Neo-Renaissance apartment buildings, grand in scale and offering ornamental moldings and Art Nouveau touches. Addams got his foot in the door of the New Yorker at the age of 20 by casually dropping off a sketch of a window washer he did during one of his city walkabouts at their main office without leaving a return envelope. He followed up with his submission months later to find out His drawing was accepted as space filler for a February 1932 issue, for which he was paid a whopping $7.50. But the thrill of this small success was dampened when 3 months later, Adams's father, Charlie Sr., dies at home of a brain aneurysm at age 58. His death was enough to motivate Addams to pursue being a cartoonist full time. He quit school and he got steady work at $15 a week retouching crime scene photographs at True Detective magazine in New York, where he did lettering, diagrammed crime scene recreating how the murder moved about the room, drew the X where the body was found, and painted the blood out of some of the grislier police shots that ran with the stories. Feeling lucky, Adams submitted another drawing to the New Yorker they accepted for publication, paying him $30. After getting paid half his True Detective month's salary for that one drawing, he submitted 3 more for publication before hitting a wall creatively. The dam broke in 1935. Testing the waters, he submitted something a little racy, and to his surprise, the New Yorker agreed to publish with a few minor tweaks. Now that he knew where the boundaries were, he continued to submit drawings with the naughty tongue-in-cheek humor that would later become his signature style, making more money than what he was earning at True Detective. By June 1935, Adams could officially call himself a contributing cartoonist for The New Yorker and a former employee of True Detective. The only problem, if you could call it a problem, is that Adams often struggled with ideas for his cartoons. Ideas for half the cartoons he sold during his period of increased exposure came from a gag man he paid named Richard McAllister. As a freelancer, Adams did well with the New Yorker. If the editors wanted something he submitted would redrawn a certain way, he would do the change with no pushback from him, even if he didn't agree. His cartoons began to increase in popularity, partly due to the magazine allowing reprint rights in other American and British publications. Those reprints provided a steady stream of income that not only supported him, but also allowed him to take a 3-week vacation in Montana. The debut of the Addams Family occurred in August 1938 and began with Morticia, who was initially modeled after a gaunt version of Gloria Swanson. By this time, Addams had settled on what would be his signature style, having mastered the wash technique or wash painting. In this style, a fine layer of color, usually diluted ink, bistre, or watercolor, is spread with a brush over a broad surface evenly enough so that no brush marks are visible in the final product. He had no intention and no ideas on developing it into a series, not even after it was suggested to him by fellow cartoonist Harold Ross. It would be a year before he would submit his second Addams Family cartoon with a modified Morticia, modeled after a girl he fell head over heels with, who would become his wife, named Barbara Jean, and what would be Lurch, the butler. This one was a hit. He received a full page and was paid $110. In subsequent cartoons published during 1940, the one that brought him the most attention from readers and made him world famous was The Skier. The New Yorker received the most requests for purchases and reprints of The Skier than for any other cartoon. Addams would slowly introduce other members of the Addams family separately. Wednesday Addams was introduced in one, Uncle Fester and Grandmama, which he modeled after his grandma Spear, were featured in others. By 1942, Addams was recognized as one of the top 4 cartoonists at the magazine, and by fall of that year, Morticia finally got a mate, a short, round man with jet black hair parted in the middle like a toupee. It was supposed to look like Thomas E. Dewey, the Republican governor of New York, crossed with a pig, but the character wound up resembling the actor Peter Lorre. Addams was indeed riding high on his fame. You could catch him having dinner with actor Boris Karloff at Random House publisher Bennett Cerf's townhome, or with fellow New Yorker cartoonist James Thurber in a cab going down Third Avenue. But he was brought down to earth once he received his Army draft notice at age 30. Stationed at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey in February 1943, word got around that he was an artist, and one day a colonel showed up suddenly and reassigned him to the non-combat duty in the Signal Corps, a separate branch in the Army established in 1860 that focused solely on effective long-distance communication. If one had to be transferred somewhere during World War II, the Army Signal Corps was the place to be. Other artists and writers from the New Yorker who had been drafted weren't so lucky, and Addams credited his recently published collection, Drawn and Quartered, for his luck. In the same month of his transfer, his mother Grace died from gallbladder surgery at the age of 66. 3 months later, Addams married Barbara Jean, his real-life Morticia, known as Bobby to her friends and family. The couple honeymooned briefly before Addams reported to the Signal Corps base in Astoria, Queens, home of the Photographic Center. Now, let me tell you how historic Addams's duty station was. The Signal Corps took over the most famous movie studio on the East Coast, Astoria Studio. The building is on the National Register of Historic Places, okay? The studio opened in 1920, and movie stars such as Rudolph Valentino, Gloria Swanson, and W.C. Fields were filmed there during the silent era. D.W. Griffith, responsible for that film, directed Fields in 2 films there. By spring 1927, 103 films were shot at Astoria. When talkies were introduced, stars like the Marx Brothers filmed The Coconuts in 1929 and Animal Crackers in 1930, and others like Claudette Colbert, Maurice Chevalier, Fanny Brice, and Burns and Allen were the first to be filmed with sound at that studio. Oh, and FYI, if you want to learn more about the history of film industry, there is a cool documentary on Netflix titled Titans, The Rise of Hollywood. Check that out if you're a movie buff. When Paramount left the studio in 1932 to consolidate its operations in California because it was losing money, the studio changed hands to Western Electric's Electrical Research Product Division, who used it as a rental facility for independent producers, financing them as long as they agreed to use sound stages set up by Western Electric Systems. This deal was responsible for bringing actor Paul Robeson to the silver screen in the adaptation of Eugene O'Neill's play The Emperor Jones, released in 1933. In 1942, the Army bought the studio to make military training and safety films, as well as entertainments for American soldiers and propaganda films for the American public. You had directors like John Huston of Maltese Falcon, Frank Capra, It's a Wonderful Life, George Cukor, My Fair Lady, and a young Stanley Kramer, who would go on to direct Judgment at Nuremberg. And there were screenwriters such as Ring Lardner Jr., who wrote Woman of the Year, starring Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. The Army would continue to use the studio until 1970. When the Army left the area, New York was facing bankruptcy, and the studio was almost forgotten about until the mid-1970s, when city and union officials decide to revitalize the area, restore the building, and modernize the studio, led by developer George K. Kaufman in the 1980s. The studio is now known as Kaufman Astoria Studios, and directors such as Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Jodie Foster, Woody Allen, Ron Howard, and Mike Nichols have filmed there, as well as TV shows such as The Cosby Show, where I attended a taping in the fall of 1988, the Thanksgiving episode. Sesame Street was filmed there, and Showtime's Nurse Jackie. Assigned to Unit A at Astoria Studios, Addams got the chance to work alongside several soldiers who would make their mark in the entertainment industry, like Jerry Davis, who would go on to produce the television version of The Odd Couple, and Stan Lee. Well, do I really need to tell you who that is? Two Disney animators who worked on the first animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, were there as well. Addams' tasks in the unit involved going to animation artist school and illustrating training films about syphilis or prosthetic devices, and a manual instructing the troops in the art of barbershop harmony, whatever that means. Though there was one rebel artist who refused to do anything assigned to him, Addams was as flexible and friendly as he had always been, getting along with everyone. Because of this unique Army assignment, Addams was still able to produce work for The New Yorker, though his output for the magazine decreased during the first 2 years in the Army. He did some of his best work during this time. He was paid $350 for a 1944 Valentine's Day cover, big bucks at the time. The magazine pressed a few of their favorites, like Addams, for more World War II content, and though he obliged occasionally, he still produced the work he was known for. In August 1944, Morticia was featured with 2 children, a little girl with jet black hair braided in pigtails, and a chubby little boy who was an angry little W.C. Fields character. After the Kitties debut, we see the semblance of a family when Morticia and her unnamed husband, the 2 kids, Lurch, the butler, and an old hag who would be Grandmama, and the hint of a mysterious object peeking from the shadows that Addams didn't have a name for. Well, he had a name. He was called The Thing, and it was featured. 3 years passed. Addams' obligation to the Army ended, and his charmed life with Bobby at his side resumed with gusto. They hosted dinner parties, bought hard-to-find sports cars, and bought a 48-acre farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which was decorated in a manner you would expect from the creator of a somewhat ghoulish cartoon. For a while, they split their time between the farm and an apartment they leased in Manhattan. Addams made good money as a cartoonist. His annual income increased from $8,292 in 1943 to $21,000 in 1946, with a $1,000 coming from his mother's estate. He solidified Addams Family with the classic cartoon Boiling Oil, which was published in 1946 Christmas edition of The New Yorker, but it would take a while before he would develop the family's backstory. He determined that they were fairly well off. He would later say some ancestor made a real killing in the production notes for the TV show. Grandmama was Gomez's mother and not Morticia's. Gomez was the only one to smoke a cigar, although Pugsley smoked one on occasion. Wednesday had 6 toes on 1 foot and was prone to tantrums, and Lurch was a man of few words bordering on being a mute. Uncle Fester was the last character added to the Addams Family and first introduced in February 1946 in a drawing titled Movie Audience. He was bald, with eyes circled in black, and pudgy hands and feet. While Fester was associated with the family, his appearances were few. Fester wasn't a family man. Addams would explain, Uncle Fester is incorrigible, and except for the good nature of the family and the ignorance of the police, would ordinarily be under lock and key. Outwardly, the Addams couple appeared happy and in love after 7 years of marriage. Their lives consisted of late-night parties, renting houses throughout Long Island, attending the Indy 500, driving his Bugatti, and sailing to Europe, stopping for 10 days in Monte Carlo. But privately, the marriage was beginning to unravel. Bobby wanted children, but Addams felt children would interrupt his devil-may-care lifestyle, even though he got along with them very well. If they were shy, Addams would draw them out. If they were difficult, he knew how to handle them. He would gift children unusual items, such as a silver and amethyst poison ring, a gleaming human skull varnished and covered with medical school signatures, a pair of antique military pistols, and an authentic gaucho doll from Argentina. And he was always Charlie to them, never Mr. Addams. Their conflicting desire for children was one issue. Another one was that Addams had been repeatedly unfaithful, having strayed about 2 years into the marriage with the wife of a coworker. Bobby knew about some, but not all, of the affairs. Eventually, Addams gave in and agreed they should try for a baby. But when Bobby couldn't get pregnant, she wanted to adopt, and Addams agreed as long as the child was older. But when an older child became available, Addams chickened out, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back for Bobby. She left him in June 1951 for their next-door neighbor, whom she married and then divorced. She later married again to John Hershey, the author of Hiroshima, a series of articles published in the New Yorker in 1946. And she finally got the child she wanted, a daughter. Addams went into a shame spiral after Bobby left him. Losing Bobby, along with losing his best friend in a car crash, drove him into a depression, which he tried to chase away by dating a string of women. One woman in particular, who coincidentally looked like his first wife and even shared a first name, managed to elbow her way into Addams's life to eliminate all the competition. Her name was Barbara Barb, a flashy lawyer who practiced international law, had numerous high-profile lovers, and caused a sensation wherever she went. Most were dazzled by the glitter and glam. Addams was smitten. But those close to Addams were suspicious, and rightly so, because Barbara Barb was a fraud. She lied about her background, the schools she graduated from, and claimed a false pregnancy twice. She was manipulative and abusive verbally, emotionally, and physically. Her erratic behavior included throwing an African spear at Addams, throwing a stiletto at his head that sent him to the hospital for stitches, and searching through his private papers and threatening to disclose what she found. And yet Addams married her in a quick ceremony in South Carolina. With each outrageous action from Barbara, he would consult his lawyer, Harriet Pilpel, who would give him advice he would repeatedly ignore. No one, not even his future third wife, could understand why Addams allowed this woman to run all over him. But what everyone didn't know is that Addams wanted out of the marriage and was doing his best to appease his crazy wife by keeping up appearances while biding his time. He suspected she was trying to kill him, especially after she took out a $100,000 life insurance policy on him and managed to gain control of his drawings. He had proof she was cheating on him in the form of love letters that he gave to his lawyer, whom he directed to have his new wife followed by a private detective on her trips to England to link up with the man that she was holding in reserve, a British aristocrat. It's not clear what happened to make Barbara finally pick up her marbles and leave, but leave she did, obtaining a quickie divorce in Alabama in October 1956 before jetting off to England to marry her British aristocrat, Lord Henry Quilton. Even after the divorce, she still haunted Addams with letters, leaving talk of her husband out of them. Addams was growing in popularity by the end of the 1950s. He was featured practically everywhere, and his name was on the lips of everyone in the United States and in Europe. He didn't just do work for the New Yorker. You could find his cartoons in advertisements and other magazines, and he was photographed for magazine spreads. Addams complained slightly about the work he had to do for his next collection, Dear Dead Days, published in 1959, and it was based on his personal research into the weird and kooky as he traveled, suggestions from friends and admirers, and some of the ghoulish newspaper clippings he received from fans. According to his friend James Thurber, some of the worst come from a minister in Georgia. The minister's ideas, which were all unprintable, left Addams horror-struck. The collection, subtitled A Family Album, was Addams at his most bizarre and showcased his fascination with death and dying. It wasn't a bit hit, however. The New Yorker wouldn't advertise it because Addams suspected they found the book in bad taste. One fan found the book to be a piece of morbid trash. A 14-year-old from Ohio called out what he thought was the problem, which was, it seemed to lack the Charles Addams touch. Addams couldn't understand all the blowback because he thought it was a good piece of work and said, I think probably that it was maybe a little ahead of its time. The 1960s saw Chaz Addams, playboy extraordinaire. Everyone sought him out no matter where he went. There was simply no one like him. Who else went to the Metropolitan Museum to have the strings of his crossbows replaced and turned up for a costume party in an actual medieval suit of armor oiled by his handyman? A string of elegant socialites, married and unmarried, and movie stars such as a reclusive Greta Garbo and Joan Fontaine filled up his social calendar. He was never short of companionship. Women were crazy about him because he was a good listener, was always upbeat and honest, and wasn't afraid to show his sensitive side. He saw women as his equals, but not all of his dalliances were light and carefree. In one incident, he almost got his block knocked off when he was caught coming out of the shower by the boyfriend of a woman he was seeing. It was reported that Addams, who was older than the angry boyfriend, held his own in the fight. His relationship with actress Joan Fontaine, the younger sister of actress Olivia de Havilland, was just as tumultuous as his second marriage, and he did his best to end it. Those close to Addams described Fontaine as vain, controlling, jealous, manipulative, possessive, and crude, and said she always had to be the center of attention. When Fontaine published her memoir, Addams was briefly mentioned, even though she got some of his best drawings when the couple split. Bitter to the end, when a friend of Addams's ran into Fontaine after Charlie's death, she said to the shock of the friend, he deserved to die. From a financial standpoint, things were looking good for Addams. He recovered from the disappointing sales of Dear Dead Days because by 1963, there was Addams Family merch, like the dolls he had to pose with for promotion, which he did with gusto. Plus, there was a television show based on the Kooky family under development and tied into the merch. He earned crazy royalties from those dolls. In the first year, he earned $769, which with inflation is about $8,118 today. And in the second year, he earned $1,757, which would be about $18,310 today. Yeah, Addams was making bank. Addams chose the names for all his characters except for Wednesday. Some he had before the production of the show, like Morticia and Pugsley, and the latter he named after a stream in the Bronx. For Morticia's beloved, however, he let actor John Astin choose when he gave him two names, Rapelli or Gomez. Grandmama, based on his grandma Spear, was called Granny Frump, and Lurch was so named after the character's halting walk. And Uncle Fester, well, he was so named for obvious reasons. I just thought that up as befitting a rotten guy, said Addams. But just as deals were being made, there was a hiccup. Adams's ex-wife, Barbara Barb, found out about the deal and sent legal notices that she owned half of the rights to all of the cartoons and the characters and to halt any production or face litigation. What Addams didn't realize is that in his desperation to get rid of his second ex-wife, he signed over the dramatic rights to all his creative work in 1960. And while all this legal wrangling was going on, Addams's complicated love life continued, and a new addition to his harem of lovely ladies was none other than recently widowed Jacqueline Kennedy. Even Caroline Kennedy remembered Addams's frequent visits to her New York residence. But whatever their relationship was, it didn't last long because he wasn't rich, and he was cast out of the Kennedys' inner circle for an indiscreet comment he made to a reporter. Plus, she said she didn't see him as husband material. She once said to him, "What would we talk about at the end of the day? Cartoons?" The biting comment wounded Addams, according to friends. There were other incidents in which Jacqueline Kennedy was condescending and rather snobbish. We all know that she eventually found someone who was husband material, billionaire Aristotle Onassis, who she stole from his longtime mistress, opera singer Maria Callas. The legal wrangling over the show got nasty, and Addams's lawyer, Harriet Pippel, who had warned him this would happen back when she was trying to extricate himself from Barbara's crazy, did damage control. She was also trying to untangle the other messes from that divorce, like Barbara being sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy and co-owner of his properties, though in reality, Addams had transferred full ownership of his West Hampton Beach property to her in 1956, something Pippel didn't know about. Addams was doing his best to placate Barbara, who had remained oddly possessive of him, though she was married to someone else. If she wasn't complaining about her health, she was complaining about how broke she and her husband were. And Addams was still undercutting his lawyer by signing agreements from Barbara even while she was in the hospital. A deal was finally struck where she would receive 10% of the cut. With the contract signed and everyone paid, Addams got $2,700, his ex-wife got $300. The script, which took 2 tries, was finally approved by ABC and the show went into production. However, Addams wasn't fully sold on the show, even though he approved the concept. It took a private screening of the pilot episode before Addams would be satisfied. He was supposed to do an intro for the show, a la Alfred Hitchcock, but he bowed out from nerves. The Addams Family finally made its debut on September 18, 1964. Addams was happy with the show overall, but he had a few pet peeves. Gomez and Morticia were too good-looking, though Addams was enchanted by Carolyn Jones and thought she had the right amount of sexy slinkiness. And though John Astin, who played Gomez, wasn't the rather squat, nasty-looking cartoon mate, according to Addams, he liked Astin's look nonetheless. Other pet peeves were the house. It wasn't dark and foreboding. Wednesday, played by the adorable 6-year-old Lisa Loring, wasn't gloomy enough. Grandmama, played by veteran actress Blossom Rock, seemed like a run-of-the-mill hag. And Uncle Fester, played by Jackie Coogan, was more clownish than sinister. One thing he did like was the swinging theme song with the dope harpsichord created by musician Vic Mizzy. David Levy, the producer of the show, collaborated with Addams to create 2 new characters for the show. Thing, a hand without an arm that was introduced in a 1954 cartoon, and Cousin It, spelled with 2 T's. Cousin It was played by an Italian little person named Felix Silla in a 2-piece costume of real hair before it was switched to something less flammable because smoking was allowed on set. A sound effects engineer created Cousin It's strange, garbled speech. Guess what? The kids loved the show. which is interesting given the double entendres and the passion between Gomez and Morticia. A critic noted that the show spoke to the monsters in children in an age when nonconformity was beginning to be regarded as an asset and not a liability. Though the show wasn't entirely faithful to his cartoon, he supported it nonetheless. He visited the set to watch a taping, took photos with the cast, and sent sketches to the cast at Christmas. He showed up as a surprise guest at a party Carolyn Jones gave at her California home she shared with famous TV creator Aaron Spelling. Addams became even more popular, if that was possible, and richer. After 2 years, the show was canceled, but by then, between the merchandising, reruns, royalties, and foreign rights, he cleared about $141,276, which would be about $1,408,608 in today's money. Not too shabby. There was a downside to all this. When the Addams Family hit, the New Yorker stipulate that its name not be mentioned or connected to the show and stopped publishing Addams's cartoons because William Shawn, the editor of the magazine at the time, felt that Hollywood had corrupted Addams. When Addams submitted an Addams Family cartoon, Shawn rejected it, stating, "I don't think we want to revive them." So, after 26 years, the once active relationship fizzled somewhat, and the rights to his cartoons were given back to Addams. He did publish other non-Addams Family cartoons with the magazine, but not at the same volume. As Addams entered his 60s in the 1970s, he saw a fluctuation in income as the popularity of the Addams Family fluctuated. He started the decade with a drop in income, but by the mid-1970s, things began to pick up. A former colleague opened an art gallery in Midtown Manhattan and sold original and limited edition Addams prints, providing a steady stream of income that couldn't be touched by his ex-wife, Barbara Barb. And speaking of his ex-wife, he never got a moment's peace from her regarding anything to do with the cartoon, since she had 50% of the rights to his work. For all her whining about her declining health and financial difficulties, she still managed to stick it to Addams every chance she got. She bullied him into making her a beneficiary and executor of his will. Somehow, without Addams noticing, she managed to legally take possession of his West Hampton Beach property he loved and everything in it, including his valuable cartoons, by finally filing the deed he signed over to her before the divorce. So basically, for the 18 years that he lived there after the divorce, he spent money on renovations and repairs on a piece of property that wasn't his. He did get a chance to revive the Addams Family twice, but once again, he allowed his ex-wife to interfere in his ability to make a deal. The company that originally produced the 1964 TV show, Filmways, approached them about a reboot. The first time, Barbara fouled that up to the point that they no longer wanted to work with either one of them. The second time, in 1977, was a little more successful, but Barbara's pushback on the licensing almost killed the deal. The NBC special, Halloween with the New Addams Family, filmed in color on a cheap set with almost the entire original cast, was a ratings flop and was savaged by the critics. Say what you want about Barbara, but she knew where the money was. Addams cleared a total of $30,000, roughly $159,972 in today's money from that deal. Addams also managed to cut a deal to get a Saturday morning animated series produced by Hanna-Barbera, which ran from 1973 to 1975. It featured Jackie Coogan and Ted Cassidy reprising their roles as Uncle Fester and Lurch, respectively. But an interesting voice replacement for Pugsley was a young Jodie Foster. The 70s also saw the drama of his complicated love life. He revived an old love affair with Marilyn Morris Matthew, also known as T, who became his steady girl. All signs pointed to T as his next wife, who he loved, especially when she cared for him after a bleeding ulcer sent him to the hospital and saw him through eye surgery. But Addams continued to cling to his bachelor's life by carrying on with a host of other women who all knew about each other, including T, who appeared to be dating other men out of some sort of revenge. He ended the decade with dating one woman who was over half his age and connected to the scandalous death of Nelson Rockefeller for over a year before he realized how ridiculous he looked and ended the affair. Addams started out the last decade of his life finally settled down with T in a ceremony at the pet cemetery at her residence. Everyone in their circle saw them as a good match that was long overdue. Without going into too much detail, their marriage was an open one, and they lived apart most of the time. But they loved and remained loyal to each other. Meanwhile, at the New Yorker, Addams found himself as one of the few remaining old guard of cartoonists who still had an office at headquarters. Most of his co-workers from his active years had either passed away or retired. Most of the new gaggle of cartoonists on staff were in awe of him, and those who had the courage to strike up a conversation found him warm and kind. Addams often expressed his admiration for Charles Schulz. With his characteristic bawdy humor, he said to a reporter that he liked peanuts, but I do not have peanuts envy. The new editor of the magazine, Robert Gottlieb, ended the banishment of the Addams Family in 1987 with the publication of 2 cartoons, but they appeared to lack the Charles Addams touch. In reality, the spark he once had for the cartoons was starting to fizzle. But the upside to this exposure was that Hollywood came knocking again. Orion Pictures approached him about a film adaptation, and his ex-wife Barbara negotiated the advance, $450,000 with half up front that was split 50-50 between the two of them. This was unheard of in an industry that usually paid 10 to 15% as a negotiation fee. But when the smoke cleared, Addams walked away with $203,979, which is about $580,061 in today's money. Addams would never see his creation on the big screen. His last 24 hours on Earth was a good one. He had spent the night at a friend's house in Connecticut laughing and reminiscing with old colleagues. The next morning, on September 29th, 1988, he left after breakfast and managed to make it back to his Manhattan apartment, but he never made it upstairs. He was found parked in front of his building, slumped over the steering wheel, dead from a heart attack. He was 76 years old. To celebrate his death, T held a party at the New York Library. I love history. You came for the truth? Thank you for staying for the story.